At this point, I'd like to transition to introducing Father Robert Sirico. As you know from Tuesday evening's introduction, Father Sirico is a public intellectual par excellence. His work, his commentaries over 2 or 3 decades have appeared in a number of different venues. Father Sirico is a parish priest, and he is the head of an oratory. And I would like to introduce him tonight through the video that will show his story in the terms of the book trailer. After the trailer is over, Father Sirico will come to the stage and begin his presentation.
My brother watched the events of September 11th, 2001 from the roof of his Brooklyn home. He later told me that the ashes of those murdered that autumn morning fell across every borough of New York. Ashes like the snowflakes at the close of James Joyce's story, The Dead, falling all across the city I know so well, with whose people and accents I am so well acquainted. After my brother related this to me, I had an image in my mind of those ashes settling on the lake at Prospect Park where I used to go fishing, softly descending on Coney Island, on the beach where I first learned to swim, and encircling the bell tower of Regina Pacis where I celebrated my first Mass as a priest, wafting on to Old Calvary Cemetery where my father was buried, and later my mother. I see the ashes that bright and sparkling late summer morning making their descent on the whole of the city. The ashes of corporate executives, secretaries, and janitors, of firefighters from Brooklyn and Queens, men who lived in neighborhoods just like my own, firefighters like Stanley Smagala, whose wife Denna was pregnant with their daughter Alexa when the towers fell.
The second building came down. I can't see, so we have no contact.
I know the sort. Their down-to-earth qualities and rough virtues of courage and hard work. I believe I may also now know something about the ideology employed by the man who orchestrated the attacks. In many people's minds, Osama bin Laden was simply a holdover from a primitive form of Islam. But if you listen closely to some of the man's own recorded messages to the world, a more complex portrait emerges. And what may have been his last recorded video message, released just after he had been killed and after the 10th anniversary of the September 11th attack, bin Laden said that the path to stop the hegemony of capitalism is to carry out a real radical change so that President Obama will be liberated, and with him everyone else, from the hegemony of these corporations. Whether bin Laden's political ideology was deeply influenced by socialist thinking is an open question. What is undeniable is that bin Laden found it useful to tap into socialism's anti-capitalist mentality and class warfare vocabulary. With the fall of Soviet communism, many assumed that such thinking was in permanent retreat. But the impulse is never further away than human nature itself. It pipes a tune seductive to the darkest elements of the human heart: envy, sloth, and pride, while promising speedy solutions to problems that the better angels of our nature crave to see remedied.
Coming up next, we'll have an early morning traffic update, but first these numbers from Wall Street. Dow lost 6 points, the S&P slid 4, and the Nasdaq slumped 14. Small businesses hit hardest as investors react.
To build an authentically free and virtuous society is far more complicated and difficult, requiring habituation to just deeds, both visible and invisible. But as far as I have been able to discern in my circuitous odyssey from my childhood home in Brooklyn, across America and the political spectrum, political, economic, and religious freedom is simply the best plan for human persons to seek and attain genuine goods. The free market rewards greatness and excellence instead of trying to eradicate them. It permits men and women the space to express, pursue, and create higher things. And it leaves room for the most effective kind of charity to those in need. Didn't our team do a great job on that? I have to join Stephen in saying what incredible people I have the privilege to work with. The dedication of this staff, the generosity of spirit, it really is unique. I can't count how many people have come up to me, people who have been at these seminars before, going back almost to the beginning, people who are new, students and business people and clergy and you name it. They have identified what I think you and I have experienced here, and that is the uniqueness of what this experience is. And in a way, it's a kind of microcosm of the market itself. There's a lot of planning that has gone on, but no single mind has planned this. It is a matter of the values that we bring, the people who have themselves freely chosen to seek out and spend their time with us, the incredible and astounding generosity of benefactors who believe in ideas, who simply entrust to us their resources that they work very hard to acquire, because they believe that the world ultimately can only be changed by the way people think, and in particular the way people think about themselves. And that's the beginning of a true revolution. It doesn't begin with politics. It doesn't begin with violence. It doesn't begin with anything but the concept that people have of themselves. And when I work with this staff and these wonderful, generous volunteers, I wish I had half of their energy. I'd settle for a third of their energy. Seeing them bound through the halls and lug heavy things and be on time for all kinds of, it's just amazing. And the wonderful faculty, many of whom are our alumni. That was part of the secret of beginning the Acton University. It was a way to re-engage our alumni, because prior to that we had small programs and we'd offer the same small program. And inevitably, after a year or two, people said, well, what's next? So we found another program that they could come to, a Socratic dialogue, and well, what's next? And some of these people were advancing their own careers, which always makes us feel good. And we came up with the idea that what we need to do is this, so that our alumni, some of our alumni could be participants, and then they take the classes as well. And so the spirit that pervades this week is the spirit that each of us bring to this. And it is so energizing, even though a lot of people are very tired after it. I am particularly honored that Michael Novak is with us. He has been a mentor and a friend of mine for, well, maybe it's better if we don't say how long that's been, but a very, very long time. And you see it in him. You see him, after all these years of being at Vatican councils and dining with popes and presidents and all kinds of things, he didn't just come here to speak publicly and to be praised, and he tottered on into any number of lectures and sat there and enjoyed them just like the rest of us. And so I'm glad that, Michael, that you could be here. I only wish that Karen could be with us as well tonight. And I know I torment him every time I acknowledge him publicly, and that is my brother in the cause, the co-founder of the Acton Institute. I said the other day at the breakfast that really I'm just the pretty face of the Institute, but he is the man who is in the sausage factory putting the whole thing together, and his modesty annoys me, as unaccustomed as I am to such displays. But he is so incredibly dedicated to these beliefs, and he, more than any other single individual, is the reason for the stability and the sanity that you see at the Acton Institute, and the professionalism and the high quality of what we offer in all of our services, and that's Chris Maurer. So let's stop for a moment and just contemplate what we've been through. It's more than an intellectual experience. Somebody described it as something like a retreat. What is a retreat? You can use the word retreat in a lot of different ways. You can use it in a spiritual way. You can use it in a military way. You retreat when you're failing. I like to think of retreat, or at least my retreat, when I think of I need a retreat, it's usually I need something that refreshes. And something that refreshes is not necessarily unrigorous. In fact, some of the best retreats you have are, that's why so many retreat houses are Spartan. You go into a retreat house, there's no television. The food is not great, not as good as we've had this week. The environment is quiet and spare, and what a retreat does in a way is just get you to concentrate on fundamentals. And in a way, this has been a retreat. It's been a retreat from your normal activities, and designed in such a way to get us all to think about some fundamentals, some very important things that we are not uninformed about, but things that we need to probe a little bit more deeply than we very often have the chance to probe, right? Things that offer us a new way, a new perspective, that give us a new vocabulary. I said I think I said it in the book, that the best compliment that I receive when I preach in my parish or anywhere is when a child, or even worse, a teenager, comes up and compliments me on a homily, and then a professor will come and compliment me on the same homily. Then you know you've done something right. And when people say to you, that's what I was thinking, but I didn't have the words to put it in, then you know that you have succeeded. And I hope that you have gone back with this new perspective, with a clearer focus on what is so important, with a new vocabulary with which to express it. Bill Buckley, who founded the National Review in the 1950s, in his inaugural issue, he penned some lines that have become immemorial. In his first editorial, he explained the reason for the National Review, and he calmly, if somewhat quixotically, stated that its mission was to stand, quote, athwart history, yelling stop, at a time when no one is inclined to do so, or to have much patience with those who so urge it, close quote. And in a way, we continue a legacy like that, because we see so much around us that we want to yell, stop. Don't you get it? Haven't you gotten it yet? I remember when we were in Central and Eastern Europe just after the fall of communism, Chris and I went around to a number of different countries. I remember that old trunk that we lugged from train to bus to hotel room, and we had in that trunk books and banners. We still left the first Acton Institute banner. I was so proud of it. It was so professional. And we left it in Hungary. And met the people in Hungary who said, "Oh, is that where that came from?" Who still saw it years later. And as we went from place to place, we saw the colossal wreck of socialism. It was still the time where you could go into a state-run restaurant in the city of Prague. And it was remarkable because you'd go into a state-run restaurant and you'd have limited selections on the menu, and those were poor. And the service was as though you had interrupted the staff when you came in. You had somehow deflected them from their day's activities when you came in to eat. So it was not a friendly greeting. And then you could go across the way to another restaurant that now, only a few of them, when we were there were only a handful of them, and they were already getting a reputation and lines to get in, and they were friendly and cheerful and fresh and had a variety of different kinds of selections on the menu, and the waiting staff were just pleasant, really welcoming, like the waiting staff that we've had here this week. And all of that was just a model of what was to come. Following the fall of the evil empire, a lot of us had great expectations. We had been very concerned that the collectivist ideology would triumph. We were hopeful of a new era emerging. The euphoria that engulfed those nations that had been under the boot of communism was palpable. People were joyful and hopeful. Instead, what ended up happening slowly was the experts from the West came. And they told them, well, you know, you don't want to decontrol your economy too much, and you want to have strong central banks, and and down the line. And they've all but stalled that incredible exuberance and growth. And as I contemplate these frustrations that some of us feel here in the United States and abroad, especially when you get some of these insights. I remember when I was first reading this kind of literature, one of the most miserable things to do when you understood what the basis of human flourishing was, that is, free human beings in an ethical society, in the context of the rule of law, when you understood what makes for a decent society worthy of the human person, the most miserable thing to do is watch the news and to listen to news analysis. Because you say, no, that's exactly wrong. Do exactly the opposite of that. And this is going on in Greece now and in France. And the recommendations they're making to Spain and Italy. So it's very frustrating. And as we look at it, I think of a time in church history when a similar kind of thing took place, where the way forward was not so clear. A time when a challenge arose that, if it had succeeded, would have deformed the face of Christianity throughout the subsequent ages to the present day. It would have made Christianity as we know it unrecognizable. I'm referring to the year 359, when, sensing an overwhelming momentum that the Arian heresy was gathering, St. Jerome, that great biblical scholar who had translated, you remember, the Holy Scriptures, for the first time into the then common tongue of Latin, penned these sad and memorable lines. The whole world groaned and marveled to find itself Aryan. After the events of these years since the collapse of real socialism, I think many of us are tempted to update Jerome's lament and to say that the whole world groaned. After all of this, the whole world groaned and woke up to find itself socialist. The monumental threat to the free and virtuous society, my friends, that we face in this historical moment, that politicians, policymakers, businesses, and even members of our churches is summed up in simply a false conception of who human beings are in their civil, religious, familial, and social lives. It's a misunderstanding of the very thing we should know the best, because we know ourselves better than we know anything external to ourselves if we just give ourselves the space to contemplate our reality. So many have succumbed to a false anthropology, and an anthropology that moreover leads to all manner of error in the sphere of economics and public policy. And it's an anthropology that sees human beings principally as mouths that consume rather than minds that create. Beings made in the imago Dei. The error of defining people by their class or their race or their grievance group to which they belong, rather than as human beings with a destiny beyond society, human persons who have a calling beyond this world, and who C.S. Lewis so memorably described as immortal horrors or everlasting splendors. That is who we are. The scriptures say that we have eternity inscribed in our hearts. And all we have to do is think about that, contemplate that, and a whole host of things unfolds from that reality. Not just that I have this destiny, but everyone who I look at, everyone with whom I come in contact, everyone I argue with, everyone I befriend or betray, has a similar destiny beyond society, and whose deepest needs cannot be met by material goods. As important as material goods are, the fundamental quest of the human heart is to rediscover its origin and faithfully fulfill his destiny. Now, the reality of our circumstance is rather mundane. It is that we are situated in the context of scarcity, and that we human beings are a composite of heaven and earth, the dust of the ground and the breath of life. That is what we are. We're not spirits inside of bodies. We're not mere animals who are bound to things by instinct. We are this unique creature, Homo religiosus, more profoundly than Homo economicus, because we know that these two realities that form our broader reality must be taken into consideration if we ever are to experience human flourishing. Now, economics is important to us at the Acton Institute for the simple reason that there is a lacuna of understanding in what we speak of when we speak of economics. I hope that in the 92 courses that have been offered here, that you are now sick of hearing something to the effect that economics is not just about finance, right? In some way, in some shape, in some form. If I know Jeff Tucker enough, probably in some melody. Chant, no doubt. That economics is more fundamentally about human action and everything that the human being brings to his deciding, to his evaluating, to his relationships. And because economics is about something more fundamental, but that takes into consideration human scarcity, it pervades the whole of human reality. This is not a utopia, but it can be a frustrating existence nonetheless. So what do we do? If you begin to see economics in this way, you begin to see the rich depth of what we're talking about. It's not numbers on a blackboard. It's not logarithms. It's not mathematics. It's human beings deciding based on their knowledge of their families, of what makes their lives easier, what they need to exist. And this touches on morality because it touches on human beings, and it touches on morality because it's the only way in which we can supply the needs of those who are vulnerable, whether that's healthcare or clothing or housing or food or salaries to support a family. All of this is in the mix. And it's why I always take the risk of saying that there is something sacramental, not sacramental in the full meaning of what a sacrament is, but a sacrament with a small s. Sacraments, at least in my tradition, I know the nuns beat it into our heads when we were 7 years old. Children, what is a sacrament? A sacrament is an outward sign instituted by Christ that gives grace. There's an outward physical dimension to every sacrament. But it's only an outward sign, and yet it's an important sign. It's a holy exchange of gifts, we say in the liturgy. Palestrina, who is one of the great composers, Jeff Tucker pointed this out to me, wrote these lines, which really come from the Mass. O admirabile commercium, creator generis humani, animatum corpus sumens de virgine nasci dignitatus est, et procidens homo sine simine, largatus est nobis suum deitatem. O admirable exchange, the creator of humankind, taking on a living body, was worthy to be born of a virgin, and coming forth as a human without seed, has given us his deity in abundance. Commercium, exchange. That's where we get the word commercial from. But how banal, how vulgar sounds the word commercial in our present collectivist-infested vocabularies. Rather than seeing exchange as the free action of a person with immortal dignity with another person with the same dignity, we see it as an exploitive act by its nature. I'm not saying that people don't exploit or can't exploit others in a market. Of course they do. But what is the solution to that exploitation? Force, coercion, bureaucracy, politics? That's coercion on stilts. And so to see it in this way, so then to look at things as mundane as the price system, free pricing, that is not regulating markets, either through abundant taxes, burdensome taxes, or onerous trade barriers, or whatever other political machinations people justify to inhibit trade or inhibit production, how can we see a moral dimension to something so mundane and material as that? Think about it for a moment. Everything that you and I purchase that has a price on it, if that price is the result of free exchange, that price will contain in it information in a kind of code, in a way where we don't have to think, but we just know by how high it is or how low it is. And what is that information? That information tells us something about the relative scarcity of the good that's been produced, perhaps the circumstances under which it's been produced, the cost of its production, the price of labor and the place that it was produced, the cost of transferring the product, that is, transporting it, the cost of marketing it, the cost of packaging it, and 1,000 other things. Then when it comes to us and we look at the price, we decide, yes, I would rather have this than the money in my pocket. And the person who sells it to us would rather have the money in our pocket than the object. This is a human exchange at its root on a multiplicity of levels. And when politicians and their cohorts inhibit that kind of free pricing or manipulate it or obfuscate the real price of a thing, then all intelligence in society is diminished because we no longer know all of those conditions because we no longer know the price. That affects our relationships, and it affects our ability to support those we love and those who are in need. If we are going to have a stable economy, we have to have a system of free pricing. We have to have banks that are accountable to the people who put the money in them. And we have to have a monetary system that is not manipulable by politicians. I want to echo what Eric Metaxas said last night about the threat to religious liberty in our nation. Now, I say this very conscious that we have a significant number of people from outside the United States here today. Fully about a fourth of our participants here are from other countries. But my friends, my international friends, if this can happen in the land of the free and the home of the brave, if it has not already happened in your country, beware. And so I want to speak to this not fundamentally as a political issue, but as an exercise in understanding the trajectory of government control of people's lives. You see, if the state gets to strip away economic freedom, this will impact every other freedom we have. The freedom to assemble, the freedom of religion, the freedom of the press. All other liberties are wrapped up in the freedom of enterprise. Because ultimately, as I said, the freedom of enterprise is the freedom of human beings to make decisions with regard to their own lives. And if the government gets to do this with specific regard to requiring religious institutions to provide services that they deem immoral, then we are in danger. And all of this stems from the control that the government presupposes over the private property that religious institutions have. Now, I have to concede right here at the outset of this trajectory, this argument, that the mistake was ever in taking the money from the government in the first place. I know very well that that doesn't make me very popular in some circles. Because, you know, when you say, but we need this money for this orphanage or for this hospital, as though this money is going to go away if the government doesn't spend it? What would happen if the government weren't spending it? And if people understood all of these connections? Well, what would happen is they'd leave it in the hands of the people who produced it. When I testified before Congress once, I was asked, well, so Father, you're saying that we should send the money back to the communities? And I said, how about don't take it in the first place? Well, think about it. So now we come to the fact that, at least as the law stands tonight, I haven't heard the evening news, so I don't know if the Supreme Court has ruled on this or not, but at the moment, we are on a collision course whereby the government has taken, 1/7 of the nation's GDP and claimed it and said, we're going to take care of you. And your health care will be cheaper. I think it's P.J. O'Rourke said, if you think government health care is expensive now, wait until you see it when it's free. And that's exactly what's happening before our eyes. You see how the intention to make things better often makes things worse? How it distorts the real cost of things? You just go into a store. Anybody goes into a grocery store and you want to buy, let's say, different kinds of cheese. So you know the kind of cheese you like, you know the kind of cheese your friends recommend, the kind they like, you comparison shop and you buy it. Imagine if the government said free cheese. Go into the grocery store, or there'll be a third-party payer for your cheese. Well, we'd all get the finest Stilton or the whatever it happens to be. And what would that drive the cost up of everything? And drive the cost up because it would diminish the supply of things. We wouldn't be able to use that subjective knowledge that we have of what is valuable to us and, more importantly, what we can substitute things with. And that's what we've done with healthcare. And the natural outgrowth of that kind of policy, that kind of creeping universalization of coverage, as they call it. I was asked, do you believe in universal health care? And I said, yes. I said, really? I said, yes. I believe in universal health care like I believe in universal food and universal clothes. I just don't think the government's the best entity to provide it. This is the thing. So what we have now is we have religious institutions that have become disordinately dependent upon the government, and then the government can begin pulling their strings. And we've seen it not just in healthcare, we've seen it recently in the kind of services that agencies, orphanages have provided for putting children in homes where the government demands that they be put in homes that would be morally objectionable to the churches. And these institutions go out of existence. Or not even out of existence, they just change the name on the front of the building so that they can keep getting the money. He who drinks the king's wine sings the king's song. And so you follow this trajectory whereby the government takes over healthcare and naturally says, well, we have the right then, if you're getting this, to mandate how it's offered. And by the way, these institutions have to provide these services. Eric Metaxas said it very well last night. Please don't think this is just about the Catholic Church and this is just about contraception or abortifacient services or sterilization. This is about religious liberty. This is about the right to private property. This is about our freedom. But the whole thing starts in this way. These eventualities bring to the surface a number of grave issues, not the least of which is this: the control that the state can presume to exercise over religious institutions once those institutions become dependent upon the state's support. Now, there's a related matter that is subtle but very important, and it is the change of rhetoric with regard to the freedom of religion and the freedom of worship. They sound like they're the same thing, but they are not. The freedom to worship is for us to communicate with the deity we believe in. We can do that here, we can do that home, we can do that in churches. But the moment this deity with whom we communicate tells us to feed the poor, to serve the dying, to have mercy, to teach children, and the moment we begin to build institutions, that's not just the freedom of worship. It's the freedom to build schools and orphanages and hospitals. And this becomes very dangerous. The debate is not fundamentally about contraception or cooperation with abortion. It's about, if we may worship, where may we worship? What kind of building may we own? And what can we do as the result of that worship if our God tells us to serve the most poor and vulnerable? No, it's only secondarily about religious freedom. It is more fundamentally about whether the state has the right to subsume all social services, all institutions, into its care, placing it under its control. Ought the government be looked to provide every need that a society has, almost as though there were no society outside of the government? Is there a role for the private sector in charitable works, in economic decision-making, in education, in the moral formation of society? Ought we to maintain and to be able to maintain freely in any real and effective way a distinction between society and the state? Or is every obligation of society to be subsumed, subsidized, regulated, and implemented by politicians and bureaucrats? Let me pause as I come to the conclusion of my remarks by encouraging you to bottle some of this energy, this hope, this knowledge, this enthusiasm that we've experienced this week. I'd like to propose a few things under the rubric of tactics, but I want to be emphatic in saying that it's not intended to be exhaustive. There's a lot more that can be said about this. What I hope is that I just leave you as you depart us with some things for you to take back and ponder and maybe bring back next year. There is and there has been, in the way some Christians think about the church, and especially about its relation to the social order, two brief errors, two concentrated errors. And I think as we look at the encounter that our Lord has with his interlocutors in Matthew's gospel, we see this brought to the head. You remember when they give him the coin and they say, should we pay the tax or not? And he says, who's on that coin? And they say, Caesar. And he says, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and unto God what is God's. In that moment, our Lord set a different trajectory in motion, one that the church, at better and at worse moments, has attempted to maintain a distinction between authority and power. Say that the church must have its liberty, and that there is a legitimate sphere for the government, but a limited one, a severely limited one, where the government does not become the resource of first resort. The notion of separation of church and state is thought in some circles to be a modern invention that is currently threatened by the likes of the people in this room. The truth of the matter is that it is a Christian invention. Even if we refuse to concede what really is a modern invention, which is that these two realms have absolutely nothing to do with each other. The trick with the debate about church and state relations is to get the balance right. For many, though not all believers, the first awakening they had to the pressing social questions is the plight of prisoners or the hardship of the poor and disfranchised, the dignity of human life, the importance of marriage and the like, was their own encounter with the Lordship of Christ. But sometimes we think that everything that is right must be implemented by law. And this is the first temptation that many religions have engaged in. That is to create a theocracy. It makes sense in a way. This is right, you do it. You don't do it, you go to jail. It's not what our Lord would have approved of. Let Caesar deal with putting people in jail. We deal with transforming the hearts. The salvation of immortal souls is the church's primary mission, but it is not the church's only mission. These two erroneous tendencies, one going in the direction of theocracy and the other going in the direction of a kind of sectarianism, a marginalization of religion from anything to do with the normal discourse and culture of formation in society. Some of our brethren think that they have accomplished their mission to preach the gospel when they have succeeded in offending a large number of people. I give you the Greenboro Baptist as an example. In this tendency, everything outside the church was polluted, defiled, worthless, obscene. This tendency fails to see that we are against the world because we are for the world. Or to put it in biblical language, Christ came not to condemn the world, but to save it. And the second tendency goes in the opposite direction, as I've described. Theocracy. To force the kingdom of God on the world, or to seize the power of Caesar and subordinate it to God. Now, my tradition has some experience with that tendency throughout history. And I just hope that you evangelicals in the room will learn from our mistakes. We don't need a new Constantinianism in this day and age. But more than the way we think about the church is something more personal. That is, our tone and our spirit needs to be convivial, winsome, open. This is a very hard thing for a New Yorker to adapt to. My brother-in-law moved to Michigan some years ago. He's since deceased. But when he moved to Michigan, I moved into a neighborhood, and I was helping to get them situated. And he was the epitome of a kind of New York Sopranos type, this kind of gruff and, And so I said, well, you found the grocery store, you found it. He said, yeah, I found all that. He said, but you got to explain to me something. I said, what? He said, now, you're in Michigan here, and you're walking down the street, and somebody comes the opposite way, and they're walking towards you, and as they walk past you, they look at you, and they smile, and they say hello. And I said, yeah. He said, what's that about? And I said, Lou, don't worry. Nobody's going to bother you in this neighborhood. When I get around my family, that New York comes out of me. I said, nobody's going to bother you in this neighborhood. He said, why? I said, because I told them, all of them, that you're in the witness protection program. So this is a burden that I have, how to be convivial, how to be joyful, how to be non-defensive, how not to be mean. Our approach needs to welcome truth seekers, even as we have been welcomed here and as we have welcomed one another. We don't all agree on everything in this room, but something different took place here. Something different. Hard-shell Baptists are having lunch with Orthodox priests in their cassocks. and nuns and Pentecostal missionaries are talking to one another about economics. My brother-in-law would have said, "What's that about?" No, I think the atmosphere of our engagement should be that of a joyous and serious orthodoxy, in the spirit and according to the model of a Chesterton and a Lewis, a Buckley and a Dulles, a Newhouse and a Colson. Our motto is and should always be, in necessariis unitas, in dubiis libertas, in omnibus caritas. As a matter of practical strategy within this movement I'm describing, it means that we have to come to trust one another's judgments on prudential matters and cultivate this virtue of prudence. I know we tend to think that prudence is the mask behind which cowards hide, but it is, after all, one of the virtues. It is the ability to judge actions with regard to judge values with regard to appropriate actions at a given time. The cardinal virtue of prudence enables us to discern the best way to achieve the truth. And so we should be open to prudence. And if prudence is the virtue par excellence of our external life, then caritas is the indispensable interior disposition which demarcates the authenticity of Christianity. In this, we have a concrete model of our engagement from no less than Jesus himself. I'm thinking of the posture he demonstrated toward objective sinners, people caught in the most embarrassing situations. What was it, I wonder, that led the Pharisees to think that if they brought this prostitute before him and threw her into his midst, that something in him might have caused him to renounce or compromise the law of Moses? Keep your eye on the ball here. I'm asking, what was it about Jesus that made them think that they could get him to do this? There must have been something in his demeanor that he was on this woman's side. When confronted with a person in moral error, do we want to stone him or her? Or protect him or her? I get the impression that we sometimes fear this impulse to love and protect those in error somehow compromises our moral theology. Indeed, what makes this story so immensely moving to me and so effective are precisely the final words that our Lord speaks to the woman, to the adulteress. Neither do I condemn thee. Go and sin no more. We see this also in his engagement with the woman of Samaria, which I could talk to you about for a half hour, but won't. So when we confront people who don't understand or who doubt our motives, believe me, I've got cases of letters from people who doubt my motives. Try, at least try, even if you don't succeed every time. Try to engage them charitably. Maybe they're saying to us something we need to hear. If we have confidence in the truth, that the market is more than finance, that commerce has more meaning than the way we use it commonly, that there is a spiritual dimension to all of this because there is a spiritual dimension to the human person, then we can have confidence to present the truth and even listen to those who disagree with it. I think this effort to bring to our faith a common sense approach to an economic system that can have a moral potential needs to be done with more than arguments, as Arthur Brooks said. Solidarity with the poor is not negotiable for us. It is not the market or the poor. It is the market for the poor. If we take the Lord's own words seriously, our encounter with the poor is a Christological event, because what I do to the least of them, I do to him. And we precisely stand against the state's dominating impulse because of our own solidarity with those who are in need. And my friends, it is not sufficient for us merely to talk about the Lord. We need also to talk to him, or even better, to permit him to talk to us. And that requires us to shut up sometimes. I'm not against intercessory prayer. I'm not against bringing to the Lord the needs that we come across, etc., etc., etc. But how much of our prayer is occupied with contemplation? With contemplating God, not for what he does, but for who he is. How can we possibly expect to achieve any of our goals if we do not spend time in his presence? And in this regard, self-accountability is very important. What I'm talking about is a formation of us as believers, so that we can bring this admittedly misunderstood message, controversial message, about the ultimate meeting of heaven and earth to our friends who can understand our own authenticity. And this will involve what I think we have experienced here this week, what I've called a new ecumenism. Now, I know that you evangelicals don't like the word ecumenism. And frankly, if ecumenism were what we've seen for the last 40 years, I wouldn't like it either. That is, liberals talking to liberals on how they can negotiate away the faith. But I'm talking about a new ecumenism, not where we sit down to discuss ecclesiology necessarily. By the way, I think all that is very important. But where we sit down to see how can we serve those who are in need. What are the systems? What are the mechanisms? What's the understanding of the economy or trade or the role of government in all of this, or the sound pricing system or sound money? All of this for the sake of the poor. And as we're looking at this and we get closer and closer and closer to the truth of this, we find that we've also bumped into each other. And in bumping into each other, getting to know each other, inviting each other to our churches or our homes, or engaging in some kind of work together, where we get to know each other well enough that we've gotten beyond the labels, and then we can have a frank and good and robust argument with one another about transubstantiation. Right? But if we don't trust each other, we can't possibly achieve that depth of conversation with one another. I began by stating that we are in the midst of a monumentally critical moment, a time when we could lose everything. And yet there remains a remnant who has not bowed the knee to Baal, the Baal of big government, the Baal of politics, the Baal of materialism or secularist ideology. My call to you tonight is a transparent one. Let us strengthen the remnant. The fact of the matter is that too many of us, especially in the developed world, have become far too comfortable and yielded to that perennial temptation to take liberty for granted. Now is the time. This is the effort to renew an understanding of our principles and our roots that makes freedom possible. The roots that form, the assumptions that form, the anthropology that formed the best and most liberal experiment in human liberty in all of history. The same principles that make prosperity possible and accessible to those on the margins. Liberty is indeed, as Lord Acton once said, the delicate fruit of a mature civilization. As such, it is in need of a nutritious soil in which to flourish. And you and I are the tillers of that soil. Liberty is a delicate fruit. It is also a rare one. When one surveys human history, it becomes evident how unusual, how precious is an authentic understanding of liberty, and as is the economic progress which is its result. We have seen recently a vivid testimony to this fact. We have seen how human liberty, as well as economic stability, particularly I'm thinking now in Europe and other places in the world, can be disintegrated. It requires constant attention, this delicate fruit. New appreciation, new understanding, renewal, moral defense, and integration into the whole fabric of society. In a trenchant analysis of the free society, Friedrich Hayek once offered a sobering speculation. He said these words, quote, "It may be that the free society as we have known it carries in itself the forces of its own destruction, and that once freedom is achieved, it is taken for granted and ceases to be valued." And then he goes on to ask, does this mean that freedom is valued only when it is lost? That the world must everywhere go through a dark phase of socialist totalitarianism before the forces of freedom can gather strength anew? And then he answers, it may be so, but I hope it need not be. Hayek here offers to us what I consider to be a partial remedy to that threat. He argues that if we are to avoid such a development, we must be able to offer a new liberal program which appeals to the imagination, which makes the building of a free society once more an intellectual adventure, a deed of courage. I think Hayek is right, partially. He left something out. We must make the building of a free society once more also a moral adventure. And I think that is the unique element that we have experienced here this week. It is a moral adventure, for its construction was morally inspired in the first place. It emerged from a vision of man as a creature with an inherent and transcendent dignity. This vision, this anthropology, inspired the institutions of Western civilization: universal rights, the right to contract and private property, international institutions of charity, the university itself. All these were formed by a high view of the human person that we inherited from our ancestors. Early, I told you in this talk, I told you about St. Jerome. A brighter side of that story emerged, you know. Of course you know. We're here. And that was when St. Athanasius came on the scene and scattered the errors of Arianism, defeating its arguments and confounding its proponents. The rectitude of Athanasius' ideas inspired the Christian faithful to rise up and affirm what they knew to be their own tradition, what they knew to be their own prayer, what they knew to be their birthright and their heritage. As a priest, of course, part of my calling is to defend that birthright. But as a child of the West, I have a second birthright to defend. That is the free and virtuous society. We must engage this critical task of demonstrating why it is not merely the technical proficiency of markets that will enable us to surmount the economic crisis we face. We must continue our efforts to convince people that economic and moral excellence is of a piece. People will never surrender themselves for an abstract point of utility, but for a moral adventure, for a deed of moral courage on behalf of human liberty and human dignity. For this, we will raise a massive movement Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.